the horrifying wedding night ritual Rome tried to erase from history. 3 female slaves carrying cloths and basins of water and oil, their faces carefully blank in the way of servants who have witnessed things they know they must never acknowledge. An older man, who she would later learn was a physician, his bag of instruments resting at his feet. And standing beside a wooden structure that dominated the corner of the atrium, draped in cloth that hid its exact shape, was a figure carved from dark wood, standing nearly 4 feet tall, with features she could barely discern in the lamplight, but which made her throat constrict when she glimpsed them. The Pranabha stepped forward. She took Flavia's hands in her own. Her grip was firm, almost too firm, as if she expected Flavia to try to pull away. "Welcome to your husband's home," the Pranabha said. "The rites must now be completed. Come." Here is what they never taught you about Roman marriage. You have seen the movies where beautiful women in flowing robes recline on couches, while servants bring them grapes and wine. You have read about Roman wedding ceremonies as quaint ancient customs, charming traditions involving saffron veils and iron rings, and verses sung in the streets. You have been told that Rome was a civilization of law and order, of engineering and philosophy, of achievements that shaped the foundations of Western culture. But you have never been told what happened after the wedding procession reached its destination. You have never learned about the rituals that occurred behind closed doors, while the crowd dispersed and the torches burned down. You have never discovered why ancient sources that describe Roman weddings in elaborate detail suddenly become vague and euphemistic when they reach the events of the wedding night itself. Why phrases like, "the customary rites were performed, and she was made a wife according to tradition," appear in texts that otherwise spare no detail about Roman life. Tonight you will learn what those phrases actually meant. You will discover why certain Roman writers declared that the wedding night customs were inherited from an era of barbarism that civilized Romans should have abandoned, but somehow never did. You will understand why the church fathers who converted Rome to Christianity described pagan wedding practices as abominations requiring immediate abolition. You will learn about the figure that stood in the corner of the atrium, about what brides were required to do with it, about the witnesses who watched to ensure completion, about the examinations that preceded and followed, about the entire systematic process by which Rome transformed women into wives. And you will understand why almost all of this was deliberately erased. Why Christian Rome destroyed texts, smashed statues, and rewrote histories to eliminate evidence of what their ancestors had practiced for over 1,000 years. The rituals were not hidden because they were minor. They were hidden because they were central, and because acknowledging them required acknowledging things about Roman civilization that subsequent generations preferred to forget. If you find these hidden corners of history as disturbing and fascinating as I do, subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell. Comment below telling me where you are listening from. And make certain you watch all the way to the end, because the final ritual I am going to describe, the one that occurred at dawn after everything else was completed, has only recently been reconstructed from fragments that survived the systematic destruction. When you hear what it involved, you will understand why the church worked so hard to ensure no one ever learned the truth. Now let me take you back to the beginning. Let me explain how Roman marriage actually worked, what it meant legally and socially and religiously, and why the wedding night rituals were not aberrations, but logical consequences of how Romans understood women, property, and the transfer of both from one man to another. Roman marriage was not primarily about love. This seems obvious when stated directly, but its implications are profound and extend into every aspect of how weddings were conducted. Marriage in Rome was a legal and economic transaction in which a woman was transferred from the authority of her father to the authority of her husband. The Latin term was conventio in manum, literally, coming into the hand, and it meant exactly what it sounds like. A bride became her husband's property in the most literal sense Roman law could articulate. Before the late Republic, this transfer was absolute. A husband had the same legal authority over his wife that he had over his slaves and his children, including technically the right of life and death. By the imperial period, when Flavia Tertia walked that torchlit procession, the law had softened somewhat. Women retained some property rights. Divorce was possible under certain circumstances, but the fundamental concept remained. Marriage was a transfer of ownership, and like all transfers of ownership, it required verification, ritual, and witness. Consider how the Romans handled other significant property transfers. When a farm was sold, witnesses observed the transaction. The property was inspected to verify it matched the seller's description. Rituals were performed to invoke the god's blessing on the transfer and to ensure that no fraud was occurring. Boundaries were walked, documents were signed, and everyone involved understood exactly what was being exchanged. The Romans applied this same logic to marriage. The bride was property being transferred. Her value lay primarily in her capacity to produce legitimate heirs, children who would be indisputably the sons and daughters of her husband and therefore entitled to inherit his property and continue his family line. This meant her physical capacity for reproduction required verification. Her status as a virgin, never before belonging to another man's line, required confirmation. And the actual transfer of her reproductive capacity from potential to active required witnessing, because a marriage not consummated was no marriage at all in Roman law. This is not interpretation or speculation. Roman legal texts are explicit about these requirements. A marriage was not complete until consummated. The consummation had to be verified by witnesses, because otherwise how could anyone be certain it had occurred? The bride's virginity had to be confirmed, because otherwise how could the husband be certain that any children she bore were his? Each of these requirements generated corresponding rituals that were practiced for over 1,000 years, rituals that made perfect sense within Roman logic, and that horrify modern sensibilities, precisely because that logic is so alien to how we understand marriage today. Let me tell you about the pranapa. Because she is central to understanding what happened in that atrium and in the bedchamber that followed. The pranapa was a married woman of good reputation, whose role was to oversee the transition of the bride from virgin to wife. Her presence was mandatory at respectable Roman weddings. She led the bride in certain rituals, she gave advice and instruction, and most importantly, she witnessed the consummation to verify that it had properly occurred. The sources are deliberately vague about exactly what this witnessing entailed. The physician and poet Serranus, writing in the 2nd century, refers to the pranapa's duty to observe the completion of marital duties. The agricultural writer Columella, in an unexpected digression in his treatise on farming, mentions that the pranapa must verify the transfer has been accomplished. Legal texts specify that disputed marriages could be resolved by the pranapa's testimony regarding what she observed on the wedding night. If the pranapa was merely present in the house while consummation occurred privately in a closed bedchamber, her testimony would be worthless in court. She would be reporting hearsay, saying only that she was told it happened. Roman courts did not accept hearsay testimony in property disputes, and marriage was a property transfer. For her testimony to carry legal weight, the pranapa had to witness directly, which means either the bedchamber was not closed, or the witnessing occurred in a space other than a private chamber. This is where the ancient sources become most frustratingly oblique, using euphemisms and implications rather than direct description. But archaeological evidence fills some of the gaps. Excavations of Roman houses have revealed rooms whose only apparent function was to accommodate observers while something occurred in a designated central space. Wall paintings in Pompeii depict wedding scenes that include multiple witnesses in positions and postures that make sense only if they were watching intimate activity occurring before them. Votive objects left at temples by new brides include thank offerings for surviving their wedding nights, language that seems excessive for a private romantic encounter, but makes sense if the night involved public ordeal. Flavia Tertia was led through the atrium by the pranapa, past the basin of water where she would later be washed, past the slaves who stood ready with cloths and oils, past the physician who would examine her before and after, toward the draped figure standing in the corner. The pranapa guided her hands to the cloth that covered it. Now the pranapa said, "You must greet Mutinus Tetanus. You must ask his blessing. You must offer yourself as tradition requires." Flavia pulled back the cloth and saw what stood beneath. A wooden figure, crudely carved, representing a form she had only seen in the graffiti that covered Roman walls. The form that appeared on amulets mothers tied around their children's necks to ward off evil. The form that stood in gardens as a scarecrow might stand, threatening intruders with its aggressive posture. But this figure was not small like an amulet, or functional like a scarecrow. This figure was sized precisely, deliberately, anatomically, for a specific purpose that became horrifyingly clear as the pranapa explained what Flavia must do. This is the moment where I need to explain something that modern histories of Rome either omit entirely or mention only in embarrassed footnotes. The Romans had a god named Mutinus Tetanus, sometimes called Mutinus Tetanus, or associated with the better-known garden deity Priapus. This god was represented as a phallus, and his worship was directly connected to marriage ritual. We know this because multiple ancient sources mention it, always briefly, always with visible discomfort, always rushing past to other topics. St. Augustine, writing in the 5th century as Christianity was completing its conquest of Rome, described the practice with outrage. He wrote that Roman brides were required to sit upon the figure of Mutinus Tetanus, that this was considered a sacred duty before consummation with the husband, that the practice was performed in the presence of witnesses. Augustine was a hostile source, writing to condemn paganism, but his description matches fragments from earlier non-Christian texts that refer to the same practice, with considerably less detail but similar basic facts. The church father Lactantius also references the custom, calling it so shameful that even namming it pollutes the speaker. The antiquarian Varro, writing centuries earlier and with no Christian axe to grind, mentions Mutunus Tetanus as a deity to whom brides were presented, using language that implies physical contact, without explicitly describing it. Arnobius, another Christian writer, provides perhaps the most detailed account, describing brides made to straddle the god's emblem, their new husbands looking on. What was the purpose of this ritual? The stated religious purpose was to seek the god's blessing for fertility, to invoke divine assistance for the bride's capacity to bear children. The practical purpose, which Romans may or may not have consciously acknowledged, was likely something else entirely. It was preparation. It was breaking down resistance before the real consummation occurred. It was demonstrating submission before witnesses, proving that the bride would do what she was required to do regardless of her own wishes, conditioning her to accept what would follow. Modern historians who address this ritual at all tend to minimize it, suggesting that the bride merely sat briefly on the statue's lap in a symbolic gesture. But the language used by ancient sources does not support this comfortable interpretation. Augustine's word is insire, which means to sit upon or to settle onto. Arnobius uses language implying not just contact, but penetration. Lactantius refuses to describe the details because they are too shameful, which would be an odd reaction to someone briefly sitting on a statue's lap. Flavia Tertius stood before the figure of Mutunus Teutonus. The pronuba guided her, positioned her, instructed her in what was required. The witnesses watched, her husband watched. The physician prepared to perform his examination afterward, and Flavia understood finally what her mother's tears had meant, what the obscene songs had been preparing her for, what being a Roman wife actually required. She could have refused. Theoretically, she had that choice, but refusal meant disgrace for her family, nullification of the contracts, return to her father's house as damaged goods that no respectable man would marry. It meant her mother's tears would have been for nothing. It meant everything she had been taught about duty and family, and a woman's role in society would be proven false, and she would be proven worthless. She did not refuse. This is the point where I need to tell you about the examination, because it was not a single event, but rather a series of assessments that bracketed the wedding night rituals. Understanding the examination helps explain why witnesses were necessary, and what exactly they were witnessing. Before any wedding could proceed, a respectable Roman bride underwent examination by a midwife or physician to verify her virginal status. This was not optional for marriages involving significant property. The examination was documented, and the documentation became part of the legal record, establishing the bride's value as a virgin being transferred for the first time. The techniques used were invasive by any standard, involving physical inspection that Roman medical texts describe in clinical detail that leaves no ambiguity about what was involved. This pre-wedding examination established a baseline. The bride was confirmed as intact, as never having belonged to another man, as carrying full value in the transaction. The groom's family had a legal right to this verification, because they were paying a bride price and agreeing to certain financial obligations in exchange for a woman capable of producing unquestionably legitimate heirs. Then came the wedding itself, the procession, the rituals, and the events of the wedding night. And after those events, another examination occurred. This post-consummation examination verified that the marriage had been completed, that the transfer of the bride from virgin to wife had been accomplished. The same physician or midwife who had examined her before now examined her again, documenting the change in her status. This created a system of verification that was legally robust. If disputes arose later, if the husband's family claimed the bride had not been a virgin, if the bride's family claimed the marriage was never properly consummated, there were documented examinations and witness testimonies to resolve the question. The Romans valued legal precision. They were famously thorough in establishing evidence for every type of transaction. Marriage was no exception, but consider what this system required in practice. The bride was examined by a stranger before her wedding. She was required to perform ritual submission before witnesses. She was examined again afterward. Every step of her transition from father's property to husband's property was observed, verified, and documented. Her body was not her own. Her body was the property being transferred, and like all property transfers, it required inspection. The wedding night itself, the actual consummation with her husband, occurred within this framework of observation and verification. The prenauba was present throughout. Other witnesses might be present, depending on the social status of the families involved and the importance of verifying the marriage against future legal challenge. The understanding that the night's events would be discussed, documented, and potentially testified about in court shaped everything that happened. Now, let me return to that atrium where Flavia Tertia stood after completing the ritual with the statue of Mutinus Tutinus. The pronaoba guided her to the basin of water where slaves waited to wash her. This washing had ritual significance, purifying her after the encounter with the god and preparing her for the encounter with her husband. But it was also practical preparation. The examination would follow, conducted by the physician, who had been standing silent throughout, observing, waiting for his role in the proceedings. Flavia was led to a couch positioned in the center of the atrium. This was not the bedchamber. This was the public room of the house, the space where business was conducted, where clients were received, where the household shrine stood with its images of ancestral spirits watching over everything that occurred. She was positioned on the couch by the pronaoba. The physician approached. The examination was thorough in ways that Roman medical texts describe with clinical precision. The physician confirmed that the ritual with the statue had been properly completed. He verified that her status was consistent with what the pre-wedding examination had established. He pronounced her prepared for the consummation to follow. All of this occurred in the presence of witnesses whose testimony might be required if any aspect of the marriage was ever legally challenged. What strikes modern readers about Roman descriptions of these practices is not just their invasiveness, but their casualness. The Romans do not seem to have viewed these rituals as traumatic or problematic. They were simply necessary procedures for accomplishing an important legal transaction. The bride's feelings about being examined, observed, and documented were no more relevant than the feelings of a farm being surveyed before sale. Property does not have feelings. Property is transferred according to proper procedures. The procedures existed to protect the interests of the families involved, not to consider the experience of the woman at the center. This is important because it helps explain why the rituals persisted for so long and why they were eventually erased so thoroughly. They persisted because, within the Roman framework, they made perfect sense. They were logical applications of Roman principles regarding property, verification, and legal documentation to the specific case of marriage. No individual Roman had to be particularly cruel or misogynistic to participate in these rituals. They simply had to accept the premise that marriage was a property transfer requiring proper procedure. And they were erased because, once Christianity changed that premise, once marriage became a sacrament rather than a transaction, once women were granted souls equal to men rather than being classified as a form of property, the rituals became not just unnecessary, but monstrous. They revealed something about the foundations of Roman civilization that the Christian world built on those foundations preferred to forget. The systematic destruction of evidence about Roman wedding practices was not incidental to the Christian transformation of Rome. It was essential because the rituals demonstrated what paganism had truly meant in practice. After the examination, Flavia was led to the bedchamber that had been prepared for consummation. The room had been decorated according to tradition, with the marriage bed positioned for optimal view from the doorway, which would remain open throughout the night. Oil lamps provided light sufficient for the pronaoba to observe from her position near the door. The slaves who would be needed afterwards stood ready in the corridor. Her husband entered. He had changed from his wedding garments into simpler clothing. He seemed nervous, which surprised her. She had assumed he would be experienced, confident, commanding. Instead, he glanced toward the pronaoba with something like embarrassment before approaching the bed. The pronaoba spoke. Her voice was formal, ritualistic, reciting words that had been spoken at thousands of wedding nights before. The bride is prepared. The gods have blessed the union. Let the marriage be consummated in accordance with the laws of Rome and the customs of our ancestors. Let witnesses verify the completion of the transfer. Let no one question that this woman has become a wife. What followed took several hours. The pronaoba observed throughout, occasionally providing instruction when she deemed it necessary, ensuring that the consummation was completed in ways that would satisfy legal requirements for verification. The door remained open. Sounds carried into the corridor where slaves waited. Everything that happened in that bed was semi-public, part of a ritual of verification that had been designed over centuries to ensure that no aspect of the property transfer could later be disputed. At dawn, the physician returned for the final examination. This examination confirmed that consummation had occurred, that the bride was now physically changed in ways that marked her transition from virgin to wife. The examination was documented. The pronaoba provided her testimony regarding what she had witnessed. The legal transformation was complete. Flavia Tertia was now a Roman wife. She would bear 3 children over the next decade. She would manage her husband's household competently. She would attend festivals and ceremonies and fulfill all the duties expected of a matron of her status. And she would never speak about her wedding night, not even to her own daughter when her daughter's marriage was arranged, because what was there to say? It was tradition. It was how things were done. It was what being a Roman wife required. The women who came before her had endured it. The women who came after would endure it as well. This was simply what marriage meant. Her silence was not unusual. It was universal. Roman women did not write about their wedding nights. Roman men did not describe what they witnessed or participated in. The rituals were so embedded in the fabric of Roman life that describing them seemed unnecessary. Like describing how one breathes or walks, everyone knew. No one spoke of it. The knowledge passed from mother to daughter in whispers and warnings, in tears shed while arranging bridal hair. In euphemisms and implications, rather than explicit instruction. This is why reconstructing these practices requires piecing together fragments from